Welcome back to the deep dive. I am just so glad you are joining us today. You know, when you fire up your laptop or you open an app on your phone, you probably don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the operating system running underneath it all.
Right. I mean, it's just doing its job in the background.
Exactly. The OS is just this invisible architecture. It's the underlying logic that makes absolutely everything else possible. And today we're bringing you a deep dive into the historical records, the biographies, and the mathematical archives of a man who, well, he essentially wrote the operating system for 20th century mathematics.
He really did. We are talking about David Hilbert.
Yeah, David Hilbert. And our mission today is to understand how this one man's just unwavering quest for absolute perfect logical certainty completely revolutionized algebra.
And reinvented geometry.
Right, and pushed the boundaries of physics, and then, completely by accident, laid the groundwork for modern computer science.
What's fascinating here is that David Hilbert, who was born in 1862 in Prussia, was not just a mathematician in the traditional sense. He wasn't just someone sitting at a desk crunching massive columns of numbers all day.
Right, he was more of
A philosophical architect. That is really the best way to describe him. Throughout all the source material we looked at, you see this core, relentlessly optimistic worldview driving every single thing he did.
He really believed, like, down to his bones, that there were absolutely no unsolvable problems in mathematics.
Exactly. During an era when some philosophers were arguing that there were fundamental limits to human knowledge, Hilbert completely rejected the concept of the unknowable.
But as we comb through his life today, we are going to see how that beautiful, optimistic worldview collided, rather tragically, with human history and the absolute limits of logic itself.
Yeah, it is a fascinating and pretty heartbreaking story.
It really is. So, to really understand how Hilbert changed the world, we have to start with the moment he walked into the mathematical establishment of the late 19th century, looked at their established rules of proof, threw them completely out the window, and promptly got accused of practicing theology instead of science.
Yeah, we are looking at the late 1880s here. Hilbert is early in his career, and he decides to tackle something known as Gordon's problem.
Right, which dealt with a field called invariant theory.
Exactly. Now, to understand this without getting buried in complex equations, just think about the concept of an invariant. An invariant is a property of a mathematical object that does not change even when you transform the object itself.
Okay, so give me an example of that.
Imagine you have a lump of clay. You can mold it into a sphere, or you can stretch it into a tall cylinder. The shape changes completely, but the volume of the clay remains exactly the same.
Okay. The volume is the invariant.
Right. So Paul Gordon, who was the reigning expert at the time, he was trying to find the core building blocks for these, the basic equations from which all other invariants could be constructed.
And mathematicians call those generators, right?
Yes, generators. Now, Gordon had proven they existed for simple scenarios using what we call a constructive proof.
Meaning he actually built them?
Literally. He sat down and manually calculated them. He built the generators using pages and pages of just grueling brute force calculations.
Sounds exhausting.
It was. And the problem was, generalizing Gordon's constructive method to more complex functions was basically impossible. The manual calculations would take lifetimes.
So this is where Hilbert steps in.
Right. Hilbert takes a completely abstract path. In 1888, he mathematically proves that a finite set of these generators absolutely must exist.
Well,
But he demonstrates their existence without ever actually building them or showing you what they look like.
okay, let's unpack this because it is such a wild shift in thinking. It's like, imagine a giant haystack, and everyone before Hilbert is spending years picking through the hay, one piece at a time, to find the needle.
Right. Their goal is to eventually present the physical needle.
Exactly. They want to present it on a velvet cushion to prove it's there. But Hilbert walks up, looks at the whole field, uses some abstract logic, and proves definitively that a needle is in the haystack without actually bothering to pull the needle out.
That is a perfect analogy.
But wait, if you can't physically show me the object, what is the mechanism here? How can you mathematically claim you've solved the problem?
Well, he achieved this by heavily relying on a logical principle called the law of excluded middle, and he applied it to infinite sets.
The law of excluded middle.
Yeah. It simply states that a proposition is either true or its direct opposite is true. There is no middle ground.
Okay, so like either a light switch is on or it's off.
Exactly. Or, for a classic example, either all ravens are black or there is at least one raven that is not black. There is no third option.
Right.
So Hilbert applied this logic to his equations. He essentially proved that assuming these generators did not exist led to a fundamental logical contradiction.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, by the law of excluded middle, they had to exist. He didn't need to calculate them. Pure logic demanded their existence.
I can completely see why the establishment might have hated that. I mean, you are telling mathematicians who pride themselves on rigorous, pages-long calculations that they can just logically assume an answer exists.
Oh, it caused an absolute uproar. When Hilbert submitted this paper, Paul Gordon himself was the reviewer.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And Gordon just could not appreciate this revolutionary abstract approach. He rejected the paper outright. He famously declared, "This is not mathematics, this is theology."
That is just such a massive academic burn, basically saying you're not doing math, you're preaching.
It really was.
Yeah.
But Felix Klein, who was another brilliant mathematician at the time, he stepped in. Klein recognized the sheer genius of Hilbert's approach.
Thank goodness for Felix Klein.
Right. Klein guaranteed the work would be published, telling Hilbert it was the most important work on general algebra the journal had ever seen.
And did Gordon ever come around?
He did, actually. The utility of Hilbert's method quickly became undeniable. Even Gordon eventually conceded, admitting later that, well, theology had its merits.
That is a gracious concession.
It was. But this whole debate over existence proofs versus constructive proofs, it birthed an entire philosophical movement called intuitionism.
Right, led by people like L.E.J. Brouwer.
Exactly. The intuitionists vehemently opposed using the law of excluded middle, especially when dealing with infinite sets, because, well, you cannot physically check an infinite number of things.
Because it's infinite.
Right. They believed that if you could not explicitly construct it, you had not proven it.
And Hilbert absolutely hated that idea.
He really did. He felt they were trying to cripple the entire science of mathematics. He famously shot back at them, saying that taking the principle of the excluded middle away from a mathematician is like prohibiting the boxer the use of his fists.
I love that quote. He's saying, "You're stripping me of my best tool just because you don't like how abstract it is."
Precisely.
So if Hilbert could completely remove the need to physically build things in algebra, it makes perfect sense that he would start looking at other areas of math that relied too heavily on human intuition. Which brings us to geometry.
Yes. Next, he set his sights on rewriting the oldest, most sacred rulebook in mathematics, which was Euclidean geometry,
Right, so by 1895, Hilbert had secured a position at the University of Göttingen.
which he ended up transforming into the preeminent mathematical hub of the entire world.
Yeah, and in 1899, he published a text called Foundations of Geometry.
This is massive. For 2,000 years, geometry had relied on the ancient axioms of Euclid.
But Euclid's system had these hidden flaws, didn't it?
It did. It relied really heavily on drawing pictures and using human intuition to fill in logical gaps, like assuming things about what a line looks like or what a point feels like in physical space.
And Hilbert wasn't going to stand for that.
No, he was not. Hilbert completely formalized the axioms. He systematically stripped away any need for human intuition.
Which leads to one of my absolute favorite details in all the sources we looked at, the beer mug philosophy.
It's such a great story.
It is. So Hilbert argued that the fundamental elements of geometry, like points, lines, and planes, they do not need to have any explicit real-world meaning. They are just undefined concepts.
Right, they're just placeholders, essentially.
Exactly. And he reportedly joked to his colleagues that instead of points, lines, and planes, you could just as easily substitute them with tables, chairs, and glasses of beer.
Which is such a German mathematician thing to say.
Right. As long as the defined mathematical relationships between the tables, chairs, and beer mugs remain consistent, the geometry would still work perfectly.
Yes.
So the rule 2 points define a line just becomes 2 beer mugs define a table. The objects themselves don't matter at all. Only the logical structure connecting them matters.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is just a profound conceptual leap. Axioms are no longer taken as self-evident, intuitive truths about the physical world.
They're just rules of a system.
Exactly. Hilbert is cementing the modern axiomatic method. Mathematics is no longer tied to our physical reality. It is a conceptual system possessing strict internal necessity. He effectively organized mathematics into an autonomous, rigorous, self-contained enterprise.
And he didn't just organize the foundation, he literally wrote the to-do list for the next century of mathematicians.
Yes, the famous Paris speech.
Right. In 1900, at the International Congress of Mathematicians in Paris, Hilbert gives this legendary speech. He outlines 23 unsolved mathematical problems that he believed the world needed to focus on.
And these 23 problems effectively set the global agenda for 20th century mathematics.
It's like he was giving them a roadmap.
He was. And rather than just dropping obscure trivia, he picked foundational questions. For instance, he included the Riemann hypothesis.
Which is a deeply complex problem about the distribution of prime numbers, right?
Yeah. Yes, and it is actually still unsolved today. He was directing the entire mathematical community, showing them exactly where the most crucial gaps in human knowledge were located. The act of formally defining the unknown was just a masterstroke of scientific leadership.
He basically mapped out the entire future of pure mathematics. But a pure abstract map of math doesn't stay abstract forever.
No, it doesn't.
Because around 1912, Hilbert glances over at the physical universe and decides the physicists need his help too, because geometry maps space, and space is where physics happens.
His pivot to physics is such a remarkable chapter. I mean, for most of his early career, Hilbert was strictly a pure mathematician.
So what changed his mind?
He was actually his brilliant best friend, Hermann Minkowski.
Ah, right.
Minkowski studied physics, and he sparked Hilbert's interest. So by 1912, Hilbert immerses himself in kinetic gas theory, radiation, and eventually the massive topic of gravity.
Which brings us to the summer of 1915, which is just an incredible historical moment. Hilbert invites Albert Einstein to Göttingen.
Yeah, Einstein.
Now, Einstein has been struggling for years to finalize the field equations of general relativity. Hilbert gets fascinated by the problem, and they end up in this parallel sprint to formulate the exact same equations.
It was a race, but a friendly one.
Right. And according to the historical timeline, Hilbert actually publishes his axiomatic derivation of the field equations nearly simultaneously with Einstein.
Now, we have to clarify what axiomatic derivation means here. Einstein was working from profound physical intuition. He was doing thought experiments and making observations about how light and gravity actually behave in the universe.
But Hilbert took a different route.
Completely different. He applied his beer mug logic to gravity. He started with basic, abstract logical axioms about the nature of space and time, and he derived the mathematical equations from the ground up purely as a logical necessity.
So what does this all mean for the history books? I mean, if Hilbert used pure logic to publish at the exact same time, why isn't it called Hilbert's theory of relativity? Did Einstein steal it from him? Did Hilbert just back down?
That is a great question. But there was absolutely no priority dispute between the two men.
Oh, really?
Yeah, none at all. Hilbert fully and graciously credited Einstein as the sole originator of the theory. Hilbert recognized that while he had mapped the equations mathematically, Einstein possessed the deep physical insight that actually made the theory meaningful.
That was incredibly humble for someone of his stature.
It was. Hilbert famously joked that any kid in the streets of Göttingen understood four-dimensional geometry better than Einstein did, but it was Einstein who did the actual physical work and not the mathematicians.
That highlights Hilbert's whole attitude toward physics perfectly. He had this famous quip where he said, "Physics is too hard for physicists."
Yes, meaning that physicists were far too sloppy with their underlying mathematics.
They were just relying on intuition.
Exactly. They relied heavily on physical intuition and played fast and loose with the rigor. To a pure mathematician like Hilbert, this lack of structure was infuriating. So he set out to build coherent, logically sound mathematical theories for the tools the physicists were using.
And that underlying rigor ended up being exactly what physics needed for its next massive revolution, which was quantum mechanics.
Right. Earlier in his career, Hilbert had developed the concept of an infinite dimensional space, which later became known as a Hilbert space.
Now, initially, this was just pure math, right?
Yes. Initially, it was just an abstract piece of pure mathematics. But in 1926, his assistant, John von Neumann, realized that this abstract space was the absolute perfect mathematical arena for quantum mechanics.
Okay, wait. Infinite dimensional space. You just lost me. You got to give me the beer mug version of a Hilbert space because my brain really only thinks in 3 dimensions.
Sure, let's break it down. Think of a standard 3-dimensional graph. You use it to locate an object in space, up, down, left, right, forward, back.
Simple enough.
But in quantum mechanics, particles do not have exact locations. They exist as waves of probability with many, many possible states.
Right, the whole Schrodinger's cat thing.
Exactly. So a Hilbert space is basically a mathematical graph that can have an infinite number of dimensions. It isn't a physical space you can walk through. It is a mathematical arena designed to hold all the infinitely complex, overlapping variables of a quantum system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Hilbert's abstract mathematical architecture perfectly unified the competing quantum theories of Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg. Without Hilbert's spaces, modern quantum physics just wouldn't have a coherent mathematical language.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are here. Hilbert has revolutionized algebra with his existence proofs. He has completely rebuilt the axioms of Euclidean geometry.
He set the agenda for 20th century math with his 23 problems.
Right. And he provided the foundational rigor for both general relativity and quantum mechanics.
It is a staggering resume.
It really is. But his ultimate final goal was what became known as Hilbert's program in the 1920s.
Yes, the grand unification.
He wanted to prove that all of mathematics could be formulated on a completely solid, finite logical foundation. He wanted to permanently banish the idea of the ignorabimus, the idea that there are unknowable truths. But this is where the story of David Hilbert turns into a tragedy.
It does. Hilbert's program demanded that we find a finite system of axioms from which all mathematical truths could be derived, and crucially, that this system must be mathematically proven to be completely consistent.
He wanted absolute, bulletproof certainty.
Exactly. In September 1930, Hilbert gave a famous retirement address in Königsberg. He ended his speech with this booming, defiant declaration against the unknown. He said, "We must know, we shall know."
And the timing of that speech is perhaps the most devastating historical irony in the history of science.
It really is, because just one day prior to Hilbert giving that triumphant speech at a joint conference held in the exact same
city.
Yes, in Königsberg,
Yeah.
a young, relatively unknown logician named Kurt Gödel tentatively announced his incompleteness theorem. Gödel mathematically proved that any consistent formal system powerful enough to do basic arithmetic will always contain true statements that are just impossible to prove using only the rules of that system.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and, well, a little mind-bending. It's like, imagine you dedicate your entire life to building this perfectly impenetrable, flawless fortress.
No.
You meticulously design every wall and every lock, confident that absolutely nothing can breach it. Right as you're cutting the ribbon and declaring the fortress invincible, a young architect walks up and proves, using your own blueprints, that mathematically every single fortress must contain an unlocked back door that you can never, ever close.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. If a mathematical system tries to prove its own consistency, it ends up creating these logical loops.
Like the liar's paradox.
Exactly. Similar to the statement, this statement is unprovable.
Right.
If the statement is true, then it is unprovable, meaning the system is incomplete. Gödel definitively proved that Hilbert's grand dream of an absolutely complete, self-contained mathematical certainty was logically impossible.
It completely broke the fundamental premise of Hilbert's program. But there is a pretty incredible silver lining to this intellectual collapse.
There is. While Gödel proved Hilbert's specific program was impossible, the sheer effort required to understand Gödel's unlocked backdoor created an entirely new discipline.
Right.
Mathematicians like Alonzo Church and Alan Turing took this intense debate over what is formally provable and computable, and they used it to invent theoretical computer science.
Which is just wild to think about.
Turing created the concept of a universal machine to test these logical limits. The very machines we use today, the algorithms running our entire digital world, they grew directly out of the ashes of Hilbert's failed quest for absolute mathematical completeness.
So his failed operating system for math became the actual operating system for computers. That is just incredible. But the tragedy of Hilbert's final years wasn't just intellectual. The world around him was collapsing too.
It was. On a personal level, Hilbert suffered immensely. He developed pernicious anemia in 1925, which caused severe exhaustion that basically marked the end of his peak scientific output.
And his family life was really difficult too.
Yes. Even worse than his health, his only son, Franz, suffered from severe, lifelong mental illness. When Franz was eventually committed to a psychiatric clinic, Hilbert tragically stated, "From now on, I must consider myself as not having a son."
Oh, that is so incredibly sad.
It really fractured his personal life and brought just deep sorrow to his wife.
And then the massive historical tragedy strikes. It's 1933, and the Nazis come to power in Germany.
This was the absolute death blow to Hilbert's beloved Göttingen.
Because they started purging the universities.
Immediately, the Nazis began purging the university faculties of anyone who was Jewish or married to a Jew. Almost overnight, the greatest mathematical center in the world was dismantled.
Just completely torn apart.
Brilliant minds, people who were Hilbert's colleagues, his friends, his intellectual heirs, they were all forced to flee. Hermann Weyl, who had literally taken over Hilbert's chair when he retired, he left.
And Emmy Noether, right?
Yes, the brilliant algebraist Emmy Noether was forced out. Edmund Landau, Paul Bernays, they were all gone.
There's this incredibly chilling anecdote from the sources about this. About a year after this horrific purge, Hilbert attends a banquet.
The Rust Banquet.
Yeah. He happens to be seated next to the new Nazi Minister of Education, a man named Bernhard Rust. And Rust turns to Hilbert and casually asks if the Mathematical Institute had suffered so much because of the departure of the Jews.
Hilbert's response is just utterly bleak. He looks at the minister and says, "Suffered. It doesn't exist any longer, does it?"
Wow.
He spent his entire life building this sanctuary of logic and truth, only to watch Gödel dismantle its philosophical foundation, and then watch the Nazis destroy its human foundation.
So, by the time David Hilbert died in Göttingen in 1943, the world was entirely consumed by the darkness of the Second World War. The funeral of the man who arguably built the framework for 20th century science was attended by fewer than a dozen people.
It is so tragic.
The wider world didn't even hear about his death until several months later.
It was a terribly lonely end for a true giant of human thought. But, his legacy definitely outlived the darkness.
It did.
If you visit his tombstone in Göttingen today, you won't see complex equations or geometric proofs carved into it.
What do you see?
You see the English translation of the words from that 1930 speech carved into the stone. We must know. We shall know.
Oh, I have goosebumps.
Even in the face of Gödel's absolute proof of incompleteness and the horrific irrationality of the war, those words just remain as a defiant monument to the human spirit and the power of pure thought.
It is an incredible legacy, and it leaves us with so much to think about.
It does, and it raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive.
What's the question?
Well, Hilbert's pursuit of absolute certainty ultimately failed because, absolute certainty in math is impossible. But without his failed quest, we wouldn't have modern computer science or the mathematical framework for the quantum universe.
Right.
So, does a theory need to be ultimately true to be profoundly useful? Or is the sheer act of reaching for perfection what actually drives human progress?
Man, even an OS with a backdoor can completely change the world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep pushing the boundaries, keep challenging the axioms, and as always, keep asking the big questions.